Welcome to Living in Harmony, a podcast for Christian parents who want to make the peace in their household without sacrificing their sanity. Here, we talk about everything from sibling rivalry to dating and how to raise your kids to be strong in their faith while maintaining your own. But don't worry, we're not all preachy here. That's the purpose of your church and your pastor. Here, we're here for you, to help you know you are not alone in this crazy journey called parenthood. So whether you're a seasoned pro or a brand new parent, Living in Harmony, this is the podcast for you. So grab some coffee or wine, we won't judge, and join us as we navigate the ups and downs of raising kids in a Christian household where the gospel is the center. Well, welcome back to Living in Harmony. We're in episode 22. We have been doing this a long time. And if you consider most of our episodes around an hour, we've spent like almost a day together talking about parenting.
A whole day.
True.
A whole day.
A whole day, Delmar.
A whole day. So if you've been listening since episode 1, we've spent almost a day together. I hope it's made your day better. But regardless, we hope that today is a good day for you. If you're hanging out, doing stuff with your family, we know everybody has seasons. Some of you are in wonderful seasons right now. Some of you are listening to this to try to escape a season, possibly. But regardless, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Delmar.
I'm Robert.
And I'm April.
And today, today's one of those things where it's like there's not a lot, but I think what we have today is golden. Okay? It's kind of like some millennials listening will get this. It's like the Turtles in Time game growing up. It was a short game, 30 minutes. But man, you give that thing to a millennial and they would just sit in front of it all day long and play it over and over and over again. Because see, it's
Time.
yeah. I guess asteroids. Would that be yours? Asteroids?
Frogger. Hubert.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pac-Man.
Okay, I wasn't going to put you in the Pong era. That's pre-you. So
But I do
Thanks.
remember Pong.
some of y'all, yeah, some people listening, they were Pong experts. So, and I'm a stickler that I think video games are harder back then than they are now. Like now, they're not as hard. But regardless of where your stance is on that, that's not what we want to get into about fighting. But we are going to talk today about fighting. We're sitting in my office at church right now. Church is about to start. Dan's going to continue in Galatians this week. We know that whole book is him contending for the faith. Quite literally, he's having to fight. And he's having to fight Judaizers in the church who are not believers. He's having to fight his own people who are being subjugated over to this theology. And sometimes the fights are in our church family. Sometimes they're in our family. Sometimes they're between our families and other families. I think about like the Beverly Hillbillies. You ever seen that show where the Clampets would get to fight with the bankers? You know, that whole thing is, but we get in conflict. And I think that we all have our go-tos, right? So before we get into like our solution or our aid, if you will, what are some of our go-tos when we get into fights? What would y'all say?
Like the good ones or the bad ones?
Like our bad default go-tos.
Oh, the bad.
go-tos?
Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say a really bad one would be, blaming the other person, coming up with excuses for why you're not at fault. Mm-hmm. Pushing the blame. It's always somebody else's fault is why I did something.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think that's what I was going to say, too. It just
Stole it.
Yeah, because that's, it's really, really easy to just to find that one thing that the other person did or that caused the problem. And if you hadn't done that, then everything else would have been okay. Even if I did 80%, it's like, oh yeah, but you did that one thing and that triggered the whole mess.
Yeah, I think of a few that come to my mind is when you get in conflicts, there are the people who they just numb it out, right? Like they just pretend like it's not existing, and these are the people who sometimes give you the silent treatment at home. You ever been gotten the silent treatment by a family member? Oh, that's the worst. If you're growing up and your dad gets mad at you or something. I know that I see that more than I'd like to, but you have the numb it out people. You have the people who tune it out, right? They play their phone, they get on Netflix, they might be into running, but they have another thing they go to where they don't actually, deal with it. And then you have like
medicate.
Yep,
Yeah.
Self-medicating, yeah. And then you have like the lash out people who they get angry and man, they just go berserk, right? They just rage. They go from like Bruce Banner to Hulk, And then you have the ones we were just talking about, the ones who blame shift. And I think that, there's several unhealthy things we pick up. And one of the things I want to encourage you with, I heard this here recently, and I wanted to share this on the podcast. There's some things we can look for when we know that a conversation is turning septic. Because you can have conflict in family, right? Sometimes we do.
Oh,
like,
you will.
You will.
Yeah, like all the time. Like, because, in most of the conflict, it's over the nitpicky stuff. It's not the massive things. But when we treat nitpicky things like massive things, it blows it up, right? So one of the things I heard, there's this podcast by a girl called Just Pearly Things, and she's a very, I guess the correct word, she like a based worldview for women. And she was talking about when women know they've lost an argument, look for the signs. And it's not just for women, it's for men too. She was using it to coach her audience, and each word begins with something. So how do you know if a conversation is turning septic? Well, you have the sign. The S is shame. So we start in the argument, we start casting shame on people. You always do this.
Yep.
You always do that. Your dad raised you this way. Why can't you be better than him? I mean, shame. We see that, and it could be over something simple. It's like, why is this coming up? That's because the person who's starting to wield these signs, number one, they might know they've lost. Number two, they just want to win. Right. So shame, insult, right, which is different when they start hurling insults. What do insults geared to do in a relationship?
No, it just breaks it up. I mean, it doesn't do anything towards advancing the conversation. It doesn't do anything towards finding a root cause or finding a solution to it. All I'm doing is attacking the person.
That's it. Pure attack. We talked about this in our own Bible study we did this past Tuesday. We talked about calling out false pastors and how when you call out a false pastor, your job is not to insult. Your job is to rebuke them with the truth of the word of God. That's pretty much our thing, right? And then the G. You want to take a stab at what the G is and look for the sign? Shame, insult.
G.
Go away.
Well, that could work. Just guilt.
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 I got it.
Yeah, which is different than shame, right? It's guilt and shame. But it's interesting. That's what the enemy likes to hurl at us for our sin. Obviously, we wield that against each other. We learned it from other places. But just guilting people, I always clean this house, you never do. Or do you remember that one time you did that? And you permanently are the reason our relationship's the way it is. Not to mention all the times you've used that excuse.
23 years ago, on that one Wednesday.
Yeah, you forgot to put out the trash, and our relationship's been trashy ever since. Our kids are acting like trash because you're trash. It's all three of them combined in one.
There you go.
Honestly, that conversation's probably happened, unfortunately. And then the last one, right? If you see the signs, N is the only one that's not one word, and that is this: the need to be right. The irrational need just to be right.
Pride.
Yeah, that one hits home for me. I have a lot of. It's really tough for me to admit that I'm wrong. In some things, it's really, really easy, but in a lot of things, it's really difficult for me to admit that I'm wrong and to say, yeah, I did a bad thing, and ask for forgiveness for that.
Yeah, because need to be right, what that entails is you having to interrupt the conversation and admit that you're, wrong. That's the only way to fight that, and no one wants to do that mid fight.
Oh, especially when you've been going at it for, minutes or hours or days. And it's like, oh, now all of a sudden I realize that I was wrong and that would have changed the whole course of the discussion.
You've got a stake in this thing.
Oh, yeah.
You've got, and I know myself, I know probably most of us listening, we have had that moment where we're like, I have been fighting to be right. And then there's like this one little glimpse of tiny little bit of perspective. No, I'm right. And and it's just like, we got to shut that out right now, even though it could be that way, and
even over stupid things.
Yes.
I mean, there was this week at work, we're in the building I work in. It's, you can't really hear what's outside. And so we heard this noise. I was like, man, we don't hear helicopters here very often. And someone looks at me and was like, dude, that's a lawnmower. I was like, no, I'm pretty sure we never hear lawnmowers in here. I'm pretty sure that's a helicopter. And about 5 minutes later, you hear that change as he like disengages the mower apart. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a lawnmower. Yeah, and even that, I could feel the cringe in me saying, oh, because I was
sad.
because that 5 minutes earlier, I was sure I was right. Right.
Which, I mean, chances are where you were, you had a good good reason to believe that.
But at the same time, it just shows that it's a stupid illustration, but it just shows that how deep seated in our souls these things are, these sinful proclivities. It's even in something like that. I mean, who cares if it's a lawnmower or a helicopter? But I had to like force myself into yeah, you guys were right on that one.
Okay, so I was going to ask, because to me that's the big win. Conflict, before it, we are hardwired with our wretchedness. Even if for those who are in Christ, we still have this already not yet heart that's already saved, but we're not yet perfect. And whenever we bring conflict up or we create conflict, when we resolve the conflict, which is our biggest hope, because one of the biggest works of the Holy Spirit in the life of believers is amongst conflict. That whole 2 or 3 gathered, that's about conflict. But what I've come to learn, and I'll offer this up, is before I can if I have conflict between you and I, before I can resolve that, I have to have conflict within myself, right? Like I have to, the unsanctified side of me has to get knocked out by the godly side of me. And you ever had do the self battle first?
Oh yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah.
I know I saw that the other day. Like we got a new bar at the house that we're using as our studio bar, and we're needing stools for it right now, right? So we have some in the house, and I told my wife, I was like, I think the ones in the house will work. And she's like, no, they're way too small. I was like, okay. And then we went over to the bar, and I had not moved them in there because she said they were too small. And then she walked in there, and they're obviously the right height, And I didn't say anything because it's a nitpicky thing. But she did a really big point of saying, hey, I was wrong about that. And it was really weird because it was like, they're just chairs. But I could tell she was doing that thing where she's like, nope, I fought him for this. Aww. And now I need to fight myself and then give him the win. So sometimes you need to fight yourself. And then here's the cool thing. This is a cool thing, right? If I'm in a fight with you and I realize I'm wrong, okay? So I got to take the L, right? But here's the cool thing. If you fight with yourself first to defeat that which is evil in you, you're actually taking the W, right? Mm-hmm. You're taking the bigger W of growing and becoming more like Christ so you can give up the little L of, oh, I was wrong on this thing. Take the big W. That's what the life of Christ is about, right?
Yeah. And something I've found in those is if I, and the lawnmower thing was, again, it was really stupid, but it wasn't really an argument. It was just like we were kind of teasing each other about it. So it was really, there was no hurt feelings in there at all. But at the same time, I knew in my soul that if I could hold on to that, I could have not said anything. I could have held on to that. I could have, but I knew that would be a hardening. That would be something that would affect me later in ways that I knew I didn't want to deal with. So fighting yourself, even in those little stupid nitpicky things, is I think often very important because it sets the tone. It allows us to practice. It's a scrimmage, maybe, if you want to use that good sports metaphor, that you can use later on when something really matters. It's like, oh, I've done this before. I've already been through this. And I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I know it's true for me. If I have practiced that in little things, those bigger things are much easier.
You sound like me telling my math students, this is why we start out with the easy problems. And I know you can probably solve this one in your head, but you're still going to write this out and show your steps, because we start with the easy ones so that you can really just master the process, so that when I throw the harder ones at you, you've got the process down and you know how to do this, and then they're not as intimidating. So
I wish I understood that when I took math.
Yeah. Well, you also didn't have me to teach.
That's true.
Your math would have been probably better.
But yeah, we do. We fight these battles, and unfortunately, oftentimes we give ourselves the L. Internally, we don't ever take the win. So what we want to do today is we want to talk about how to fight. Right? There's just 5
I'm ready.
things.
Let's go,
Let's
Delmar.
fight. Actually, we're going to teach. We want to talk about how
my
to fight
gloves
today.
on.
You need to fight. You need to fight because if you don't fight, then fighting's how we get clarity, right? Like fighting. What good things come from fighting? You know.
Well, God didn't make each of us the same way, right? He didn't give you the same insight he gave me. He made us different and then he put us together and said, you guys need to live together for, hopefully 50, 75 years or something like that. And so, but even still, after all the time we've been together, we still see things differently. We interpret things differently. And so that I think that's a good thing, because it forces me to have to exhibit Christ-like qualities. It forces me to become more like Christ, or it allows me the opportunity to do that. It doesn't force me to. If I want to be healthy, it does. But it allows me the opportunity to become more Christ-like by behaving in a Christ-like manner in, either a disagreement with my wife or my family or anybody else.
Well, and it also, this goes right along with what you're saying, but it also allows us to just die to self more and continue to strive to put our own wants and our own agenda aside and remember to, to put the other person's needs is more important, which we don't always do.
That's huge.
Definitely don't do perfectly, but that's another side of that as well.
Yeah, it's like one of my favorite verses, Philippians 2:3. As much as you can, consider other people more important than yourself. Which honestly, if we did that, a lot of this would be avoided, right? But in true preacher fashion, we're going to use an acronym.
Love acronyms.
Yeah, a true old school backwood, found in a Baptist pew preacher. Good stuff. Easy to remember.
More than 3 points, though.
More than 3 points. That's true. So this isn't pure. This is not pure Southern Baptism. Okay, this is more of a refined, reformed version. Okay, okay. But seriously,
like
number one, and this one's a big one. We actually covered it last week with the podcast, but you can't leave it out of this equation. If you leave it out, it doesn't work, because it's one of the first things that has to happen, right? If we're going to fight well, the first thing to have in your arsenal is forgiveness. Yeah. Right? Jesus teaches. Quite literally, where you stand on it. Scripturally, obviously, we believe grace is free, forgiveness is free, but Jesus teaches in a very conditional way. If you think about it, he says, if you remember Matthew 6:14, he says, if you want to forgive others as I've forgiven you. He teaches as a transactional way. Mm-hmm. Not that our forgiveness is predicated on his forgiveness, but it's very much like, you've been forgiven, bro. Right. You need to forgive.
Yeah, that parable, one of his scariest parables is the one, where he's talking about, and I don't remember off the top of my head where it's found, but where he's talking about the servant who owed, the two servants who owed essentially $1 zillion, and the servant comes to the master and says, yeah, I can't repay this, and he's like, all right, your $1 zillion is forgiven. And then that same servant goes to another servant and is like, yeah, you owe me 20 cents. And it's like, okay, I'm going to put you in prison because you can't give me back the 20 cents. Right. And that, I think that's what we do so often, is we forget what God has forgiven us from, what he's pulled me out of. And if I really remember that, then it makes it so much easier to forgive somebody else.
Which really brings us to this foundational principle of parenting. If you're going to fight well in your family, if you're going to have a family that fights and gets the spiritual wins, if it doesn't start in the gospel, you're not going to have a foundation for it, right? The gospel teaches us that we've been forgiven for so much more than what we'll ever offend anyone with, or that what anyone else will offend us with. And if we are withholding forgiveness, we really don't understand what Jesus has done for us.
Yeah, I think one other thing, especially as a parent, you have to balance forgiveness with justice or consequences, right? I can't just forgive everything my kids do, because if it's like, oh, that's okay, oh, that's okay, oh, that's okay, they don't grow and they don't learn, right? So you have to sometimes either allow them to experience the consequences of their actions, or give them consequences to experience, so that they grow from that. So there's there's a balance to that forgiveness. It can't be, the moral quality of it, the spiritual quality of it can be, in essence unconditional.
Right.
But there's another piece of it that has to have, there has to be some consequence to
It's like what we were saying on the podcast last week, that forgiveness is free, but trust is not.
Right.
And if your child sins or is fighting poorly or creating division, sure, forgive them, but that doesn't mean they get the car again, right? That's what they snuck out the house using your car. Like that actually, now you need to be punished because but that's kind of the thing though. Like forgiveness is not just haphazard. I mean, you think about the people Jesus forgave the woman caught in adultery. He says, "You're forgiven. Go and what? Sin no more." Like he gave her, here's your marching order. So when we offer forgiveness in fights, especially whenever we've been wronged against, I think it's important to draw the parameters of what this forgiveness looks like. But then also this means as well in fighting, you need to ask for forgiveness. We talked about that on a previous podcast, the importance of asking for it when you need it, even if it's with your kids. If not, your children will be scared of you, or they'll have, interesting feelings about you because you're not humble.
They'll grow up to be like you and
in the ways that you don't like.
doing you right.
Yeah. You never see that, do you?
Oh no.
Just like the parts of yourself and your children, and you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
I know where they got that.
Oh, and I'm so sorry. It's in my genes.
Well, and honestly,
I'll blame it on Granddaddy.
some of that had happened. I mean, years back, there was, when my kids were younger, there was a time where I saw just some things creeping up in their attitudes and personalities that I didn't think were okay. But I also recognized, I think I modeled that for them. And it convicted me of a change that I needed to make in myself. But I also went to them and told them, like, I modeled, like, I see what's going on here in your attitude or in your behavior. And I modeled that for you. And I'm now actively working to make a change in me, because that's not good. And you need to, like I told them, like, you need to know that I'm trying to make, change that about me, and you need to change that about you. But hopefully my example will help you see.
Man, that's a parenting hack. Okay. If you're listening, like, that is gold, because basically what you're doing is you are laying down the discipline on your child, but you're owning your part in it. So that way it doesn't feel like just this massive offense on your child. What you're saying is, this is wrong. This is evil. I repent. Now you need to repent.
Yeah. I'm
sorry. Will you forgive me for teaching you this? It's like because now they're like, wow, this is really bad. And you're not yelling at them. You're yelling at yourself
right.
in front of them. I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Write it down. Don't worry.
Yeah, right. Okay, which brings us to our next one, actually, because you could not do that unless you did the next part in this fight, how to fight well. And the second part, the I, is introspection, right? Because Jesus, the most taken out of context verse in the Bible, judge not. Well, that's out of context, because what is all of the context around that? What's Jesus teaching us how to do?
How to render proper judgments.
Right.
Yes, how to judge ourselves, right? I can't take the speck out of your eye if there's a log in my eye. So the condition is remove the log, then I help you with the speck, right? But so if you're going to fight, it's really important for us to say introspectively, what part of this was mine?
Yeah, and I think that's really, really huge. And April hit this, and I watched her do this, and I watched the kids respond to it, and it was really effective, because it shows, like you said, it shows that principle is true, and you really have to think through things, and back to what we were, when you were talking about how not to fight, right? When you see that need to be right. This is where that when you feel that need to be right come in, you need to listen to that, right? It's like, oh no, I'm right. Well, okay, are you? Or are you, are you just, is that pride? Is that just something that you just want to win? And especially, it's so easy to just, especially dealing with kids, it's so easy to just overpower them. It's like, I'm wiser than you, I'm smarter than you because you're 4, right? But they'll see through that. They, even at a young age, they can pick up on hypocrisy, and they can understand when you're not holding yourself to your own standards.
Well, and something else that I think about, which I don't know, you guys think this is, just me, the mom, thinking big, or long-term dreaming or whatever. But when you're raising your kids and you're making these decisions and how you're going to handle admitting when you're wrong, taking ownership for things that you might have modeled badly that you're trying to correct, and things like that. I'm always aware of the fact that my kids, and of course now our kids are all adults now, but they were growing up there along the way, and many of you listening have kids different ages, and but all of our children are eventually going to be adults. They're most likely going to be married. They will be in relationships. They will be treating someone else another way. And the way we model things, the way we model conflict, the way we model resolution, the way we model taking ownership for our own mistakes, not putting blame, we're modeling behavior that they're going to turn around and grow up and treat someone else that way. And one day, now we have, our oldest son is married, and, so we've got a daughter-in-law, and, there's layers of things that we have done with, our kids growing up, that now our oldest son, he's implementing things in his marriage. And so, I'm so thankful, and, I feel very thankful and blessed watching, their relationship continue to grow and stuff. But, all of the things along the way of how we behave, that ultimately they're going to be putting that on, someone else that is going to come into their life, going to be a part of your family, and they will be affected by these things. And so really we are doing these things to keep, harmony with each other, to live rightly with each other, to treat each other well. But it's also little by little, these are investments. It's every one of these is you're dropping another piece of a coin into this investment of the next generation, and how they're going to be treating people, and they're going to be raising a family, and they're going to be instilling things. So there really is, a legacy of behavior that starts with every time we make these decisions to handle the, arguments right. And like you said, push out.
And some of us weren't taught how to do this properly as children. And so, if you watched your parents, fight poorly, that doesn't mean that you're doomed to continue that. That means you've probably got some bad habit patterns that you're going to have to intentionally change. But it's just like, if I haven't exercised, if I, eat too much chocolate, which I probably do, then you have to change those habits if you're going to get healthy. You have to identify those and deal with those. And hopefully, a concept like we're talking about today can help with that.
And when you really spend time dwelling on, why am I this way? Why am I acting this way? You're future-proofing your own self, right? Mm-hmm. It's one thing I would encourage, if you're going to be an introspective fighter, if you're going to be someone who really gets to it, as much as the issues come up, when the fight first comes up, I would encourage you to tell yourself, the problem is a symptom. Bury that line in you. The problem is really a symptom. It's not the actual issue.
The issue is not the issue.
Right. Yeah. The problem is a symptom. So when you see your child acting out, so say your child steals your car and runs away. Okay. That's a big case scenario. Let's throw it out there. It's happened to people.
Yeah.
The problem isn't they stole your car and ran away. The problem is a symptom. First of all, they felt like they needed to do that. Second of all, something's going on that would make them have this very rebellious, high moral issue. Third of all, why don't they trust you enough to ask, right? Fourth of all, Like, is there, and then you get into, okay, so those things are issues. Okay, so is there a secret sin? Is there some secret sin in your family as a whole that you see? Is there something they've learned about you? There's like, but if we just say, oh, you stole the car, we're going to punish you for that. You've accomplished nothing, right? Yeah. So like introspection is so important when you sin. Ask yourself, why did I do that? You know, there's times when like say you're trying to kick a habit, right? If like there's been I've done Whole30 over the years, right? I mean, it works. It really does. I mean, I lost 60 pounds a couple of years ago doing Whole30, and the problem is you're coming off sugar, right? Which is a highly addictive thing. I mean, it is like crack. I mean, and I'm not over exaggerating. In some ways, it's addicting. It's addicting. So whenever I'm coming off sugar, my first week, man, I'm not pleasant. I'm just going to be honest.
Nobody wants to be around.
Yeah, no, right? So I got to be aware of that. If you're in a space where you're trying to overcome an addiction or you're trying to correct a self habit, realize you're going to be a little more antsy. You know, and let people know that, because then that'll get to our third things. Will help us get to the G in fighting, which is grace. Right? There needs to be grace in it. You know, Paul in Colossians, he says that our words should be seasoned with grace. Yeah. I love that, because it means the words are the substance, but there's this packaging on them. There's this seasoning on them that can either inflame or can put out. I can't remember who used the illustration, but every conversation you walk up to, you either walk up with a bucket of water or gas, you know, a fire. I mean, and that's what we have to realize is, what are we walking up to the fire with? You know, a bucket of water or gas.
That's a great illustration.
Yeah.
I like that.
So like when it comes to giving grace, like we need to model that for our kids, which means being slow to anger is really important, you know, which is difficult because some of you work 12 hours, you come home, your house is a wreck that you cleaned yesterday, right? And now, you know, your kids are not willing to go to bed, or vice versa. And it's in those points where we have to remind ourselves to season everything in grace, which is difficult because, you know, if I think about this, in our family, we like French fries. I'm not going to lie. There's a new place in town called BTJ's. So in front of Bowling Alley, and they have Lowry's seasoning salt there. When you walk into a restaurant and they got Lowry's on the bar, you know they're serious about their food, right? And I learned something. You get the fries and they're just normal. They're okay. But if you take the extra minute, walk over there, put the seasoning on the fries, they're great. And it requires a little effort. It requires, you know, a little. I mean, it's small, but like this is the difference when it comes to something going, you know, a scrimmage versus nuclear in your family. So in as much as you can, wrap it in grace. You know, this is, if your spouse yells at you, you can actually tell them, listen, I understand you're frustrated. I'm not going to participate in that kind of conversation. And the only emotion you're going to get from me right now is love. But feel free to express your heart as long as you can give the grace.
And I think that's, you know, as you tie that back to introspection, sometimes that means offering grace to yourself, right?
100%.
You know, when you recognize, oh, that thing that I'm seeing in my kid, that thing that I'm seeing in my spouse, that's a reflection of my behavior, right? That's something that I've caused or that I've enhanced. And so now you're wanting to shame yourself. Now you're wanting to challenge yourself. It's like, all right, that forgiveness is available to me inside myself too. So as I'm, like you said earlier, as I'm fighting that fight inside myself, you know, that is not something that I have to like gut it up and fight internally. Sometimes that's a release. That's like, God, only you can do this in me, and allowing him to work in me, and then listen to what he tells me to do. It's like, oh yeah, now I need to go apologize. Now I need to go do this other thing. But then accepting that mistake I made, even if it's a big one, even if it's a history of, you know, a habit pattern, that doesn't mean that I am stuck to it forever, that there's redemption in that, and that's something that God can work in me and through me and can change, and I can direct that back to the rest of my family.
And it goes back to what you said, the only way you can obtain that, to send it back to your family, is if you first have received that grace. You know, grace receivers are grace givers. And it's hard for us to model this if we don't have it. This, we ultimately receive grace through Jesus Christ, through our salvation, through the power of the Holy Spirit, which means, and here's the thing, this is tough. There's people listening right now, your children are not believers, which means you have access to something they don't even have access to. Does that mean that, okay, they get a pass and can act like however they want in our house? No, but that helps us give grace. Me knowing my child doesn't even have the ability for this. In our family, my oldest, I'm fairly certain he's got like a calling on him. I don't know if it's ministry calling, but he's got this little spark in him, and I could tell he understands the things of God. My middle, I'm 50-50 on, you know what I'm saying? I don't know. He'll just get into a rage sometimes. And I have to realize, okay, he's not even professed Christ. Like he's a kid learning how to handle his emotions. He's probably had for the first time. Mm. So that's when I have to sit down and say, okay, this is not okay. This hurts mom and dad's heart, hurts God's heart. Why are you doing this? I could try to get the introspective thing, and then you ask a 3-year-old why, they're gonna be like, I don't know, or because I wanted to. He hit me, right?
So that sounds like asking a 14-year-old, why'd you do that? I don't know.
Oh, I could use another example. I'm not going to. Okay. But okay, this brings us to our H in how to fight well, and that is Philippians, right? We talked about it's in Philippians. It's humility. You're like, Philippians doesn't start with an H. No.
I was just thinking that, Delmar.
Yeah. No, it's in Philippians. We talked about it earlier. It's humility. It's the ability to look at the other person as a person. I know my mother, she said one of the best things she ever heard for her marriage is because every few years in marriage you have a space where you feel like, okay, we're in a weird space right now. We got to figure out, we're in a new chapter in our marriage. How's it going to be right now? Some people call that renegotiation, whatever, every 5-10 years. And I guess they were in one of those spaces. This is probably 15 years ago, but she started asking herself, Lord, help me see my spouse the way you see my spouse, not the way I see my spouse. And I've never forgotten that. This past week, I went to the movies with my mom and dad. I have not done that in probably 15 years. Dad said, want to see a movie? Yeah. We went to the movies, just me, mom, and dad. And I'm sitting there, and because thank God my wife was so kind that she watched the kids, so I got my mom and dad. And I look over, and my mom and dad are just sitting there holding hands in the middle of the movie theater, in the dark. No one has to see it. No one has to know. They're not putting on a show for anybody. And I just look at that. I'm like, that comes, that my mom's prayer has been answered, right? And that took a massive act of humility. Because generally in marriage today, if somebody says, they're starting to frustrate me, whose problem is it?
Well, it's their problem if they're frustrating me, right?
Yeah. And they are the problem. But I love the way my mom said, help me see him the way you see him. You're willing to die for him. And her mind went there and her heart followed. And in conflict, that is such a true statement. Make your mind go there first. Your heart will follow. You may feel like a hypocrite. I'm choosing to be. No, just because you don't want to doesn't make you a hypocrite, because you are actively working against your desire. Actually, that makes you godly.
I think one of the things, one of the most important ways to think about humility is it's kind of the opposite of my rights, right? So if you think about rights, you owe this to me, I deserve this. Well, humility is like, maybe I don't, right? Or even if I do, I'm going to set that aside, right? I'm gonna set my rights aside like Christ did. He, excuse me, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped a hold of, but he set all that aside to come down and be a servant. And that's what he's calling us to be to one another, right? And for a moment, especially to the guys, right? As a husband, you're the Christ figure for your family. It is your calling to put your command, it's my command to put myself my own needs below those of my family. I don't feel like getting up and going to work and providing. I don't feel like being kind. I don't feel like doing some of these things that I have to do necessarily. But I have to do that because that's what God's calling me to do. And I think it's that kind of thing when you come into conflict is also important. You can't approach it from a perspective of, you can negotiate, but you don't negotiate from a perspective of, I'm going to get what I'm owed, right? That's not how you have to approach it. You have to look at it as, I'm going to restore the relationship. I'm going to put her needs, I'm going to put my kids' needs ahead of my own. And that might mean, and often does, at least in the short term, that might mean that I do something, or let me say this carefully. That might mean that I accept being wronged, right? That I am not right in this argument. That I put myself up there. That doesn't mean I allow my family to do something wrong or sinful or evil, right? So that's not what I'm saying. But that might mean that I have to put my rights aside, my personal rights aside for the moment in order to bring the relationship back into harmony, to bring the family to be more Christ-like.
Yeah, and ultimately, all those are actions that you've taken. Those are things that you do. Humility is one of those things you don't always, this is really important to me. Humility is not always the things you feel. You don't feel humble. I'm quite prideful. That's probably my biggest vice, right? So what I have to do is I have to actively work against my feelings by acting humble, right? And there again, I say that not in a way to say I'm disingenuine, because that's who I know I am in Christ. That's who I aspire to be. But I know that my feelings are not there yet. And sometimes if we're fighting in our families, it's okay to feel like you're fighting parallel to who you are, especially if who you are is an ungodly thing and the thing you're fighting parallel with is more sanctified. Let that win. Right? Take the loss. Sometimes it's really difficult. And sometimes we'll take the loss at first, and then eventually we'll feel like, oh, I gotta do the Don't ever give yourself that win. Stay humble, stay in the vein.
Yeah, die to yourself sometimes means dying to yourself, right? Sometimes it means that.
Yeah. So I would encourage, like, when you bring humility into a fight, that is the silent killer, right? Those are the IEDs of fights, if we're talking the military language, because no one sees that coming, because you expect the retaliation, you expect the blow up, and when you don't give them that, they don't know how to respond, right? Some of your spouse, like, it literally would just take one act of humility, quiet humility on your part or on my part, right, to totally change that relationship, because that's all our spouse wants, is to be loved. If it's a woman, if it's a man, we want to be respected, and that's what Scripture says, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the biggest thing that gets lobbed in there that clogs up the love and respect pipeline? It's pride. It's why we don't do that. So which brings us to the last thing in this whole how to fight. So you got forgiveness, be introspective, give grace, humility, and the last part, which is very important, talk it out. You got to get in a room and talk. This is Matthew 18, right? Which is in large in part what that scripture is about. It's about this interpersonal, one-on-one conflict, right? It's about the conflict amongst believers. This isn't necessarily, we were talking Tuesday about how to correct false teachers. A lot of times that's Galatians 2. It's on a larger scale, more public scale. But like here, this is in a room, right? On a phone, or not over text, okay? But it's when human to human in contact. So, and that's what Matthew chapter 18 says, is he has one-on-one. Then if you can't, you take somebody, and you practice this in your home. Like if my wife punishes our kid, or disciplines him, and he doesn't listen, guess who she's bringing next? Me, right? And then if that, it says then we kick him out of the church. So now he lives in the yard. Okay. No, but seriously, within the means of the realm of context, but that's what we're called to do, is to handle it one-on-one, to talk it out. And which goes against some of our fight tactics, which is ignoring. Often yelling is not talking it out. So, I will say this, just knowing your own children, I've watched them model this amongst each other. I've watched them get frustrated with me and then come back and say, hey, this is where I'm at. Right. Which is fine. I mean, and vice versa. Cause when you live with people and you do life with people, and if that doesn't happen, you're not doing it right. So talk it out.
And I think in a family context, it's also important to know, we'll start, but sometimes you need to bring in, good counsel, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not a sign that's not necessarily a sign that something's super broken. And that's not a sign of weakness. And that's not a sign of, sometimes that's just a sign of cluelessness. I've not been in this place before, and I need to go find somebody who has been. Scripture tells, older women to teach the younger women how to behave, older men to give wisdom to younger men. And sometimes we need that. It's like, hey, I need to talk to somebody who's been married 35 years if I've been married, 3 years. And it's like, what did you do? How did you handle this? What is this? What wisdom do you have for me? And that's really important. That's one of the key things that the church, a properly functioning body of believers, allows us to do.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I like this talking it out being like the pinnacle of this, how to fight, is because this is your red flag that the other things are not working, that you're not doing the other. If you're unwilling to talk it out, you're not humble.
True. If
you're unwilling to talk it out, chances are you're not giving grace. You haven't looked inside and seen your offense versus God, their offense, and you definitely haven't practiced forgiveness. So there's a saying my mom used to tell me growing up, and it's true, and I use it now. And sometimes I want to go get food out the fridge at like midnight. And now that you're an adult, you can just do that. When you're a kid, you can't, right? And I remember my mom when I was a teenager, because I've always struggled with like fluctuating. Like I'll go over and then way under, and it's just my thorn in the flesh. But something she puts in my mind is, are you hungry enough to eat an apple? That's a good way to put it, because if I want to go in the fridge and grab some Pop-Tarts, she goes, no. Are you really hungry? Yeah, I'm hungry. Well, would you eat an apple? No, you're not hungry. If you won't eat the simplest food, you're not hungry. You're addicted. And I think this is similar here, right? Okay, are you willing to talk it out? Because if you're not willing to do that, then what you have is an addiction. Chances are it's an addiction to our own self. It's our own argument. It's our own way. I was like, yeah, very, very similar. So let that be your litmus test. Are you willing to talk?
And talk it out doesn't mean an opportunity to just remind the other person how they were wrong and how you were right either. So
good caveat.
We need to also kind of clarify that talking it out really does mean the intent is to, in love and with grace and with humility, to come to a loving, Christ-honoring resolution, which usually does not start with, well, this is why you were wrong and you were wrong and you were wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a good introspective thought is, if when you're talking, you're not exhibiting the other four characteristics, especially grace and then into forgiveness, from a position of humility. If you're not doing those things, then yeah, you're not doing it right.
And you're not really talking.
No.
You're talking,
maybe lecturing.
Yeah, that's probably better.
And really, one thing because sometimes in some kind of conflict or some kind of argument, one person might have really been the one kind of in the wrong. Sometimes, it's pretty, it could be equally, both parties equally contributing. But, even if you're in a situation where the other person really did wrong you and you really were kind of the victim, I hate to use that word, but in that particular, the wronged person in that situation, one of the things that I think is good to keep in mind is, okay, maybe in this particular instance, really kind of the other person caused it, but in the grand scheme of life, there's so many things that we are each guilty of, that we are forgiven of, that it's just good to keep in mind. Okay, so in this one instance, maybe I was right and that person was wrong, but there's plenty of times where I wasn't right and where I wronged somebody or where I had to go back. And so, I mean, I think that's a good thing to keep in your mind to help you, again, going back to the humility and the grace, so that even when you are the one wronged, you can still remember that you wouldn't want other people to judge you every day based on the worst day of your life that you had. That's a good point.
Yeah.
So,
and it's really important also to put in there the caveat. You might have not sinned to create this conflict. You might not be the one who's responsible for creating the conflict. And that may be the very thing that makes you sin in the conflict. Right? Because I didn't do it. At me about that, bro. I'm going to put you on blast. And now our response, when we could have taken the godly approaches to prove over and over and over. And listen, if you're a human, you never had this itch, I question your humanity. Okay?
Right.
Because we've all been wronged and we have this deep desire for justice. I know I do.
Yeah.
And here's the deal. When you feel that desire for justice, just thank God that no matter what happens in the situation, justice will be met. Every sin is going to be atoned for, either on that cross or in somebody's eternity.
Right.
So let it sit in that. Rest your hope and your desire for justice on that. Because if not, then we try to get our own weird versions of justice, and we tend to, next thing you know, we're the ones on the other side of the conflict.
Right.
So
I always want justice when I'm the one who was wronged. I don't generally want justice when I'm the one doing the wrong.
Exactly.
I generally want some sort of forgiveness or grace at that point.
Well, that being said, I think we're about to go and hear a sermon about how we need to be forgiven and we need to receive grace, because we're in Galatians. I know today we're in the hot seat. We are crushing up on it. So it's been good hanging out. I know, Robert, you're about to get out of town. April, you're about to go out for a couple days. And we hope you have a safe travels. And we will be back next week. My name is Delmar.
I am Robert.
I'm April.
I hope you're living in harmony. Have a great week.